Welcome to another video about using Logos Bible software to prepare for the Sabbath School lesson. My name is Raymar Vettner. I thank you for following me in this series so far. We've come almost to the end. This is now lesson number 12 of this second quarter. And thank you for all of you who have promoted these videos to your friends and those who have written comments to me. I have enjoyed the interaction with all of you. And I hope you have learned some things in your Bible study for the Sabbath School and in your use of Logos that you can use in the time ahead. Next week is going to be the last video, lesson 13. And since some new SDA packages in Logos is coming out, Gold and Platinum, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's in those new packages in case some of you are going to upgrade to a bigger package. I'll talk about that next week in the last video. Now we're going to talk about lesson 12, Jesus in Jerusalem. It's the last week of Jesus' life according to the Gospel of Dr. Luke. Well, maybe before we begin the lesson, I chose to show you some courses here on the home page. Something that has happened in the last week in the world of Logos for Adventists. If you choose to show courses here in the sidebar, some of you might have invested in some mobile education courses from Logos. John Pauline, our very own Adventist, has made the first video course in Logos. John Pauline has made two courses, one on the Seventh-day Adventist perspective on Revelation. It's a great introduction to how to study the book of Revelation. What principles do we need to keep in mind when we are studying this book? And then he goes in depth through chapters 10 to 14. So a lot of you know John Pauline. He is the premier Adventist scholar on the book of Revelation, who is alive today. None above him in my view. So if you want to have a course, video course by John Pauline, I'll just give you some examples here. The dragon, maybe. What you have in the video courses is you have these video lectures by John Pauline. I think it's altogether 15 hours. If you buy the course, 15 hours in the two courses by Pauline, one on Revelation and one on biblical eschatology. So you can watch Pauline talk about the book of Revelation and eschatology. So you have the videos and you have transcript of what he has been saying, and then there is a lot of interesting suggested reading, how to read more about the topics he's been talking about. That's new since we spoke last week. John Pauline's video course is now out in Logos. It's somewhat expensive, but if you love the prophecies, it's well worth the investment. All right, let's dig into the lesson for this week. On Sunday, it talks about the triumphal entry in Luke 19. I suggest that we take a look at the harmony first. So if you go to the harmony of Old Testament and the New Testament. So if you open your library and you type in type:harmony, you'll find a lot of books that are harmonizing, for instance, the different Gospels, but you also have some Old Testament in New Testament, like this here, Old Testament quotations and allusions. There's another one called Old Testament quotes in the New Testament. So just open one of those. It's a good idea to open both of them. Sometimes they have a little bit different Old Testament quotations to show. In Luke 19, 38, we have this saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." And where is that taken from? Well, if you open this resource, you will see it's taken from Psalm 118. That the King, the Messiah, would come in the name of the Lord. So just a quick reminder how you can find Old Testament quotations in the New Testament. Where is this from? We'll open one of those two resources, or both, that you have here, Old Testament quotations, Old Testament quotes. You have it in your library in the category of Bible harmony. The type is harmony. Now, the lesson author writes that what important lesson about false expectations can we take from this account? This account in Luke 19 about the triumphal entry. That it says that the disciples expected, at the bottom of on the page on Sunday, it says his disciples were so caught up in the traditions and teachings and expectations of their own time and culture that they completely missed his earlier warning about what would take place and what it all meant. So they expected when Jesus was riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, he was riding in as a king. Now the Messiah would start his reign in power and glory. And they obviously had misunderstood something in Jesus' teaching. That's what the lesson says. And that, of course, is true. The disciples had not completely understood what Jesus was about to do. And Jesus had told them earlier that he did not plan to reign as a king in Jerusalem. Jesus, in the Gospels, Jesus never repeats the Old Testament theocratic promises about ruling on the throne of David. Jesus never repeats those promises. But I'm not sure if we should put it so harshly that the disciples, they had their own expectations from their own time and culture. Yes, that's true, but it was also the expectations of the Old Testament that when the Messiah came, he would rule on the throne of David. It's not just their culture. This is Old Testament expectations. So let's not be too harsh on the disciples. It was actually prophesied that there would come a king, a Messiah, who would rule in power and glory. The fact that the Messiah would come 2 times. He would come once and then he would go back and come a second time. And the second time he would rule over the nations. And the fact that we're still waiting for that second time to come. That was somewhat of a surprise for the people of God. That's not very clear from the Old Testament that there would be 2 comings of the Messiah. So, just to give you some text that you can study in your Sabbath School lesson on Sabbath on this topic of expectations. In Luke 7:18-23, we have John the Baptist, another man who had some expectations. He expected the Messiah to come, and he understood that to be Jesus, that the Messiah would establish justice in the land. But instead of justice, John the Baptist is now put in prison by this immoral king, Herod Antipas, and eventually John the Baptist gets killed. So what happened to the fire and brimstone? What happened to the day of judgment that John the Baptist expected would happen soon? So when he's in prison, he sends his disciples saying, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? Are you sure you are the Messiah, Jesus?" And in that hour, Jesus had healed many people of diseases and plagues, and so on. So Jesus answers them, "Go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed," and so on. Of course, this is Messianic prophecy. You find ideas like this several times in Isaiah. Isaiah 61, for instance, preach the good news to the poor and the brokenhearted and the captives, and those a year of the Lord's favor. But notice what it also says in the very same prophecy in Isaiah: the day of vengeance of our God. Jesus conveniently forgets to quote this part of Isaiah 61 because Jesus knows he's going to do this in his second coming, which we are still waiting for 2,000 years later. But in the Old Testament prophecies, these were all merged together as one event. So when John the Baptist and Jesus' disciples and the other Jews at the time of Jesus expected the Messiah to rule and establish justice and throw out the Romans and get peace on earth and vengeance for God's enemies, that was not just according to their time and culture. That was part of the expectations of the Old Testament. The fact that God said, okay, let's do this in 2 phases, 2 comings, is a little bit of a surprise. We shouldn't be too harsh on the Jews for expecting this. There are some hints in the Old Testament, like Daniel 9. The temple will be rebuilt, but it will be destroyed again. And in Luke 21, of course, Jesus is talking about this destruction of Jerusalem. So Forget the idea of me ruling on the throne of David in Jerusalem. It's not going to happen. Jerusalem will be destroyed. Yeah, there are some things Jesus told them that they were a little bit slow at picking up. By the way, this sermon in Luke 21 about the destruction of the temple is still in the future when Jesus is riding into Jerusalem in Luke 19. So this sermon Jesus hasn't even told the disciples yet. So I do agree with the lesson writer that they didn't pick up all of Jesus' teaching because they were very preoccupied with their expectations. I just wanted to add that their expectations were not just their own culture. It was actually part of the Old Testament material. It was part of their Bible. The expectations were not there for nothing. It was slightly a surprise that it turned out in the details to be 2 comings of the Messiah and not 1. On Monday, we're talking about the cleansing of the temple story later on in Luke 21. So let's go back to Luke 21. After the triumphal entry, you have Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, and then Jesus cleanses the temple. If you open the fact book, it's under tools. You have a fact book, and if you type in court of the Gentiles, you'll get up some images here. So open the fact book under tools, type in court of the Gentiles, and you will see several interesting media, several different illustrations, depending on some cases how big package you have, how many books in your package, and so on. But I think all of you, no matter what big or small package you have, you should get some illustrations about the temple at the time of Jesus, Herod's temple. And what you will see is, maybe we should do this one first. I like this one. Here we have what we maybe think about as the temple itself, the temple proper, with the holy and the most holy. And then out in the courtyard you have the altar. This is the court of the Israelites, so the Jewish man. Out here you will have the court of the women. But outside all of this, you have the court of the Gentiles. So let's go to the other illustration. We have the temple with the holy and the most holy. And then we have the court for the Jews. And then outside here, we have the court of the Gentiles. That's where people from other nations would be when they came to Jerusalem to worship the God of Israel, Yahweh. What was happening at the time of Jesus was that this courtyard was filled with people buying and selling sacrificial animals and changing currency, changing coins, money changes. In the fact book here you should have some links to different Bible dictionary articles where you can read more about this outer court, the court of the Gentiles. But let's open up a synopsis of the Gospel. So let's read the temple cleansing in all the 4 Gospels. So let's see if you open up one of those synopses of the 4 Gospels. Personally, I prefer Kurt Arland's synopsis. I think that's a very good one. That's the one a lot of Bible scholars are using. But if you don't have that in your package, just open one of the harmonies or synopsis of the Gospels. Type in Luke 19:46. You will have the cleansing of the temple in all the 4 Gospels. You will see that Luke actually has the shortest version of it. In Mark and in John, you have an interesting detail that my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. And that was exactly the problem of at the time of Jesus. They used the court of the Gentiles, where all the nations were supposed to come and worship the God of Israel. This is the area they used for the buying and selling of animals and changing money. Those services in themselves were quite useful for the worshippers who came from afar. If you were traveling to Jerusalem, and it's quite of a hassle to bring a lamb, for days of traveling, weeks of traveling if you're coming from other countries. So it was a useful service that they provided for the worshippers, that you could buy a sacrificial animal there at the temple. It was also a good thing that you could change money and pay your temple tax in in the money that was allowed to be paid for the temple tax, which was the coin from Tyre. The Tyrian coinage was such a high level of silver that that's the one that they wanted. It kind of had kept the value because there was so much silver in it. If you come from other countries and other currencies, you had to change the money. Useful services. So the fact that Jesus poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned the tables in John, the fact that Jesus was driving out those who were selling animals, that doesn't mean that those services themselves were bad, but it happened in the temple. That was the problem. It should have happened outside the temple. Now it took up this important space that was reserved for the Gentiles, so that when it was prophesied in the Old Testament that the temple should be a house of prayer for all the nations, when people came, non-Jews came to worship, they should have a place of reverence and peace and quiet, contemplation, and when they can pray and worship God. That wasn't really possible at the time of Jesus because of all the otherwise useful commercial activities that took place right here. They should have been taking place at other places. And actually earlier it did take place further away. Alright, on Tuesday we read about the parable of the wicked vine dressers, as the lesson calls it. Luke 20, 9 to 19. So again, if you go to the library, type in harmony. If you find these Old Testament quotations and allusions, if you open that one, it's this yellow little book. It has a yellow cover. And if we now go to Luke 20, let's see, Luke 20 from verse 9. The reason that I recommend that you open both of these Old Testament quotations and Old Testament quotes is that sometimes one of the books have some Old Testament quotations and then the other one will have some other ones. You don't always find all of them in both. So, but in the orange one with the orange cover, they have this nice convenient parallel to Isaiah 5. So when you're reading this parable in Luke 20 about the vineyard, you might be wondering, is there some other parable in the Bible, maybe in the Old Testament, about a vineyard? Is Jesus making an allusion here to the Old Testament? And of course you can just open a search panel, go to Bible and search for vineyard, and you will, if you look long enough, you will eventually come to Isaiah. Yes, here we are, Isaiah 5, and this is actually a parable in Isaiah. It's called Let Me Sing for My Beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. So it's a poem, which is kind of like a parable because you have symbols here. It's an allegory. My beloved has a vineyard. Who is the vineyard? Well, down in verse 7, Isaiah 5:7, the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel and the man of Judah. So the owner of the vineyard is the Lord, and the vineyard is the house of Israel. And God, as the owner of the vineyard, had done a lot of work with this vineyard. What more could I do? Judge, what more was there to do for my vineyard that I haven't done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, it yielded wild grapes. So, when Jesus starts his parable in Luke 20, verse 9, and he starts saying, a man planted a vineyard. Everybody were like, oh yeah, we know that poem, that allegory. That's in Isaiah. Isaiah was a very popular book at the time of Jesus. Everybody knew the stuff in Isaiah. So this was familiar for them. They knew the story. God is the owner of the vineyard, and the vineyard is Israel. But Jesus is adding some details to this parable. He says that the owner, God, let it out to tenants. So who are these tenants who are running the vineyard? Well, obviously, logically, they must be the leaders of Israel, because they are in charge of running the farm. And he went into another country for a long while, this owner. Then he sent servants to the tenants so they could give him some fruit. Who are these servants that the owner sends to pick up the fruit? Probably, as the lesson says, probably the prophets that God sent over and over to get the fruit that God wanted from Israel. But prophet after prophet came, and instead the tenants didn't give them fruit. Sent him away empty-handed. And then another servant, and prophet after prophet was sent. Finally, the owner of the vineyard said in verse 13, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son." Who is the son in this allegory, in this parable? It's Jesus, of course. And instead of respecting him, they want to kill him. They being the tenants, the leaders of Israel at the time of Jesus. They wanted to kill Jesus. So, when Jesus was finished with this parable, they knew that this was spoken against them. So, you have that even, let me see. Oh yeah, here in verse 19, we have that. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So Jesus is not criticizing the vineyard as such. It's not the whole people who's bad here, but it's the tenants. It's the leaders of Israel, the scribes and the chief priests. The leaders of Israel, they are not doing the job they should do as leaders. So Jesus is here taking a parable from Isaiah 5 and adding some details to it. He's adding some facts about the tenants. The leaders of Israel are bad, and gives them some critique. All right, on Wednesday we have another story. He's just continuing to go through the story here in Luke 20, and God versus Caesar. And I'm very happy that the lesson writer says towards the end of Wednesday that when Jesus talks about render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, sometimes a lot of preachers say, oh, this is Jesus talking about paying tithe to God. You should pay money to Caesar. You should pay the tax to Caesar, and then you should pay to God God's money. So it's money to Caesar, money to God. You should pay tithe and offerings to the church. Well, I don't think that's what's happening. And I'm very happy that the lesson writer doesn't make this connection to tithe and money either. Instead, the lesson writer says that living under Caesar, whose currency is used for day-to-day necessities, has its obligation to Caesar. So, let's pay money to Caesar. Let's pay tax to the government where we live. But there is another obligation, a greater one, which arises from the fact that we are made in the image of God, and that to Him we owe our ultimate allegiance. Now, how did the lesson writer of Sabbath School lesson get this idea about the image of God? Well, I'd like to show you an interesting book in Logos. I think he's right. I think it's very perceptively seen. Because at the time of Jesus, the Jews were very preoccupied with this idea that we are created in the image of God. Just cleaning up my screen here. There is a book that you can buy in Logos, which is called Judaism of the Second Temple Period, written by David Flesser. David Flesser, he died in 2000. He was the leading Jewish scholar on the New Testament and on Jesus and the Gospels. He is rumored to have become a Christian by the time he died, that he had accepted that Jesus was the Messiah of the Hebrew Scriptures. But he was silent about that conviction, at least throughout his scholarship. But he really did a great job getting Israeli scholars interested in the New Testament and in Jesus. So whether he actually was a believer in Jesus the Messiah or not, rumors are that he was, but whether he was or not, he did a fabulous job raising the awareness of Jesus and the New Testament among Jewish scholars. And the other way too, of teaching Christian scholars about Judaism at the time of Jesus. David Flusser really was a bridge between Judaism and Christianity in his life and in his scholarship. And in this book, which you can buy in Logos, costs $34, or if you are upgrading your SDA package to a bigger package, the SDA Platinum, which is coming out pretty soon in a few days, it will be part of that SDA Platinum package. That was the commercial of the day. But on page 59, there is a very interesting story that Shmuel Safrai, who wrote this article together with David Flusser, they're quoting a story from Hillel. You remember that Hillel and Shammai were two rabbis a generation before Jesus. So they were dead at the time of Jesus' ministry. But Hillel and Shammai were important figures, leading rabbis, and they were so big that they had followers, disciples, and they became like schools of interpretation among the rabbis, among the Pharisees. Hillel, usually a bit more liberal, flexible in the interpretation of the Torah, of the commandments. Shammai, a lot more strict and conservative. Jesus usually sided with Hillel's interpretation of how to keep the Sabbath and other commandments. Jesus usually went with a bit more flexible interpretations like Hillel. But in the case of divorce and remarriage, Hillel said you can divorce for whatever reason you want. If she's burning the food, you're allowed to divorce your wife. Shammai said no. There is no divorce and remarriage. You are married for life. You're one flesh. And Jesus takes the same position as Shammai. Now, here is a story of Hillel, Rabbi Hillel the elder. He concluded his studies with his disciples. He walked along with them. So Hillel and his disciples were walking one day. His disciples asked him, "Master, where are you bound? Where are you going?" He answered them, "To perform a religious duty. I'm going to keep one of the commandments now." "What?" they asked. "Is this religious duty?" He said to them, "To wash in the bathhouse." Said they, "Is this a religious duty?" They knew that there were many duties, and in order to protect the 10 Commandments, the rabbis had a lot of rules around it. So in order to keep the Sabbath commandment properly, they had all these rules about what to do and not to do on the Sabbath. So they knew there were a lot of rules, a lot of duties. But taking a bath, taking a shower, was that one of the duties? "Yes," he replied. "Yes," said Hillel. "If the statues of kings which are erected in theaters and circuses are scoured and washed by the man who is appointed to look after them, and who thereby obtains his salary, then how much, nay more, he is exalted in the company of the great of the kingdom, then how much more," this is typical rabbinical arguing, kal vachomer, how much more? If this is true, how much more is this true? Remember when Jesus talked about that even you who are evil, you give good gifts to your children, then how much more will God give good gifts to his children? How much more? It's typical rabbinical argument. If this is true, then how much more is this true? Jesus uses it several times, and the other rabbis, Hillel says, if it's true that somebody has a job to wash the images of important people in the theaters and circuses, how much more I, who have been created in the image and likeness of God, as it is written, for in his own image God made mankind. So, if it's important to wash the images of big people in the statues in theaters and circuses, how much more important is it to wash the image of God, which is me? I am in the image of God, says Hillel. So this story reminds us that at the time of Jesus, the concept of we being made in the image of God was very much a concept in the foremost in the mind of the Jews. So when Jesus says, when they asked him, should we pay tax to Caesar or not? And it was a crafty, tricky question, because if Jesus said no, don't pay tax, he would get the Romans on, after him and putting him in prison. If he said, yeah, you should pay tax, he might lose some of the popularity as the Messiah, because They didn't want a Messiah who told them to pay taxes. They wanted liberation. But Jesus told what he was convicted of. He was convinced that paying tax to your government is important. Whether you like your government or not, pay tax. Anarchy is worse, so pay your tax. But as part of his answer, Jesus says, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." All right, so if this coin had the image of Caesar, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Okay, the coin has the image of Caesar, so give the image to Caesar. Give Caesar's image to Caesar. And to God the things that are God's. This is not talking about giving money to God. The parallel here has to do with image. Where is the image of God? As Hillel points out, that's us. I am created in the image of God. You are created in the image of God. So what Jesus is doing is giving a little devotional to these people who came to trick him about the tax question. Jesus says, yes, pay tax, but that's not the most important. The most important is that you give your life to God. He gives them an evangelistic appeal to give the life to God, a devotional. Please, you need to be converted in your life. Give yourself to God. That's the point of this saying. That's the point of the passage that we are talking about on Wednesday. So please make that clear for your class on Sabbath. And if somebody wonders, why did the lesson writer talk about we are made in the image of God? It's because that is the parallel Jesus is making. We are made in the image of God, while the coin is in the image of Caesar. And if you want to buy this book here, to make this nice quotation, or you can pause the video and type it down and read it for people on Sabbath. It's a great story from Hillel that illustrates this thing about we are in the image of God. Well, I think the time has gone for this week's video. Thank you for following me once again. And thank you for joining me in all these videos this quarter. I wish you all the best in your Sabbath School teaching on Sabbath, and see you again for the last video next week.